further ado, I'd like to invite up the first speaker of the event. You can just be wherever you want.
Okay.
Feel free to move the chairs as well if you want.
If you've had a positive relationship with a close male friend for 3 years, he's been nothing but kind to you. One day, he gets drunk, he rapes you, you never speak to him again. These instances are 1 in 4 for women. It doesn't matter if this relationship was the best you have ever had. How it ends is how it is defined. Like, that is the end of it. A few things to do in this speech. Firstly, then, on framing, then on depth of impact, and then on how this permanently reframes your perception of the relationship. Okay. Firstly, then, on framing. How do personal relationships end? I think, with the exception of death, a relationship of any form ending inherently involves a degree of unhappiness. Why? Because the reason you're in a relationship in the first place is mutual care, is friendship, is proximity. Like, for this to end, there has to be some sort of disjunction. Either one or both people in the relationship feel an emotion that makes them want to end it, right? Bad endings are really common because communication is hard, because people change. This looks like 50% of marriages ending in divorce. I think also endings look proportional to relationships. It is how it falls apart. This is where an ending starting looks like. Like, the marriage is still over before you sign the divorce papers, right? I think what this means for the debate is that an ending isn't necessarily like the second you sign this document, right? The ending is the moment your relationship starts to turn abusive in your last 2 months, right? This is where the ending of relationship is. It's where it falls apart. This looks like the last 2 years of a 40-year marriage is your wife, like, I don't know, rotting away on chemotherapy, becoming a shell of who you once knew and dying, right? This looks like maybe the end of your like high school relationship is when the moment your boyfriend cheats on you. Okay, and then finally, what does like matters more look like? No, this is a believes that debate. You don't need to prove that it's better for an individual to focus on one or another, only that it has a greater impact, right? I think the metrics here that you should think about is the impact on individuals, is the deep, long-lasting emotions and tangible impacts on these people, and finally, how the relationship lasts. What this looks like, I think, is the general course of the relationship the majority of time. For example, in a toxic relationship, this is really harmful because when it's good, it's really good. If a relationship's good like 80% of the time, that is the course of the relationship, that's how you view it. I think that's super harmful. Okay, firstly then, on depth of impact. The first mechanism here is that endings are inherently emotionally charged. I think these are moments of your entire relationship amounting to these like moments before it disperses forever. Like, there's a lot of effort and energy here. The deeper and more significant this relationship is with romantic, familial, friendship, the greater the impact of this. I think often this involves like a grandiose pivotal moment, right? A death, a massive argument, a scandalous discovery, right? This is where your relationship begins to fall apart from this point onwards, right? Secondly then, there's a really wide fallout. I think relationships are inherently a foundation that your life revolves around. It forms all the other aspects of your life. This looks like a relationship with your parents forms where you live, your stability. This looks like how a relationship with friends controls the activities you do, who you sit with at school. This looks like a romantic relationship defining your assets, your social dynamics, your work circles, right? What this means for the debate is that when fallout happens, there are tangible impacts to all areas of your life. This looks like you go through a divorce. This looks like losing custody of your kids, like losing half your assets. Maybe your friend group blows up as a teenager and you're excluded socially and have to move schools. These things have irrevocable harms on the rest of your life. You have to weigh that really tangibly, because not only does the ending define the relationship itself, it defines the rest of your life around it. No. I think thirdly then, trauma lasts a long time, right? This is notably very different to like the way a relationship is framed in your mind. It controls how all your interactions in all regards are ever perceived by you. I think intense endings have grave physiological harms on the people involved. A, because you live through it and you see it. Watching someone die, watching your boyfriend kiss another girl at a club is confronting and real. But B, because like your proximity with this person makes you think they're invulnerable, makes you think they would never harm you. This means surprise creates exceedingly more distrust and shock. What this looks like is someone cheating on you, saying horrific things to you. You permanently distrust people who say they love you for the rest of your life, right? Maybe in your next relationship, you pry too much, you're too controlling. You like ruin your ability to have a successful in the future. I think maybe this also looks like, a heated argument between a husband and and he hits his wife at the end of the relationship, right? Maybe you have to get a restraining order. Maybe you wake up in cold sweats in the middle of the night thinking about it, right? We tell you this impacts the entirety of your life. Therefore, the ending is inherently so much more impactful because it's more wide-spanning because you can never escape it. Before I move on to reframing relationships, I will take that POI.
Don't you think that emotional fights are really hard and people are often just slowly pushing away because it's physically easier?
No, I don't think this is true. Because what do we tell you about relationships? We tell you they amount to a certain point. If you're consistently, distancing yourself really slowly, this does two things for the debate. One, if it does happen, there's still a terrible ending because you feel awful that, someone's slowly pushing themselves away from you. You feel invaluable. We tell you there's always negative emotion involved that's not a benefit. But I also just tell you you're more likely to come to a point of conflict because relationships are really messy. You can't just slowly divorce away from your husband. There has to be a point where you decide that this happens. Okay, then on how this reframes the relationship entirely. At the top of this, changing how you view the relationship matters the most because that's how you will forever perceive how it did last. This controls how it matters in the debate. Okay, so why does the ending therefore taint perception? 3 things here. Firstly, looking back in hindsight is clearer. There are aspects of relationships that don't matter to you during the duration because they don't seem relevant. Looking back with new information makes you realize issues that you didn't. This applies in 2 ways. Firstly, it corrupts innocent aspects of these relationships because you're looking for things in accordance with your feelings. This looks like perceiving that your ex to be a lot more evil than you are. Maybe little annoying habits are deemed now in your mind as intentionally malicious. Your ex is really terrible. You feel like someone actually just hated you for the duration of your relationship. That's really big harm. But secondly, you actually realize things you did miss. This looks like he wasn't just going on lots of business trips because now you know he's a cheater. This reframes how you perceive this, right? You understand red flags that were hinted at way earlier. This makes you feel stupid for not catching it earlier. This makes you feel really terrible. What this means to the debate is important because it controls your view. It provides harm to you because you view someone as having wanted to hurt you. Secondly, this applies in reverse in forgiveness metrics, right? Even in positive relationships, we still win here. Why? Because maybe a parent who shunned you for being queer forgives you on your deathbed, right? Maybe this moment of retribution makes you search for tokens of love in reverse. You view your relationship differently. You feel loved and connected and seen. This is massive. But thirdly then, on grief, right? Death is a black hole. No matter how positive a relationship was, grief is an inescapable reminder that you can never have that back. This was taken away from you. That person, was ruined from you. You can never talk to them again. Maybe your wife dies at 33. You don't think, but I love spending our 5 years together at Coney Island. Wasn't that nice? You think, my wife died in a horrific car accident. I can never love again. I am alone for the rest of my life. Nothing will ever fill this void. That is unable to be resolved by their side. So it's something that weighs on you so ridiculously heavily. At the end of this ending now becomes the crux of your memory of this relationship. When you think of how things lasted, you're always brought back to the ending. That matters to you more. Neg has to do a lot of work to knock this out of the debate, otherwise it distorts all of their benefits. I am proud to stand.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and welcome up to first meeting.
If you're watching a movie, reading a book, or judging someone else's relationship, you are always told not to judge something by one scene, or one moment, or the cover. You don't know the full story. So why does the affirming side of the house expect us to view an entirety of a relationship just by how it ended, which we think it can be poorly, and we think it can be really good to help the individual with understanding? 3 things in this debate. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why the end isn't actually reflective of the entirety. And third of all, why the sum actually gives the individual greater understanding, which they can then put forward into their future relationships. So firstly, on setup, what's the end actually look like? We give you 3 categories on neg. First of all, we see death. And we think this is quite a common one. First of all, if you're an old person, all your friends are going to die around you. Second of all, if you're in some sort of relationship, one of you is going to die at some point. So at least it's a 50% chance that someone will die. Everyone will die in your family at some point. So we think this is the most common thing that we see. First of all, this looks like it's out of control. Like it's not someone's fault that they get cancer or dementia. So why are we then putting that emotion onto that person for dying from cancer or dementia? And we also think that it's often saddening, but in no way reflective of the relationship as a whole, Even if it's 1 year, the end of this relationship, we don't think that's reflective on what could be 10, 20, 30 years of this relationship. We don't think it's good to judge it off of that. Second of all, we look at things like fizzling out, like people moving away for work or just a growing distance because of incompatibility. First of all, we view this as not being really spiteful a lot of the time, and second of all, we think it's because of external factors or incompatibility, therefore we shouldn't be judging it by the end again. Now, third of all, we look at things like bad terms, cheating, and abuse, something that the affirming side of the house has gone over and over again. We heard from them that, a quarter of women actually, are in a 3-year relationship with their best friend and then they're raped. No, that means, that statistic is that 1/4 of women will be raped in their lifetime. That does not mean that they have built this big and deep emotional connection with their rapist. This means that they could have been raped by someone that they don't even know. This means that it is not reflective on this debate at all. We view these examples, these bad terms, abuse and cheating, as a small proportion. They're often blown up by social media, and the majority. We also view it's unlikely because a lot of people have relationship integrity. They don't want to get cheated on, so they don't want to try and give the other person signs to then cheat on them. And we also think, second of all, that there's signs throughout the relationship, signs that we think are very beneficial to someone when they look at the relationship on the whole afterwards. Even if we can't prove to you that cheating and abuse and bad terms, we can't really win on that. But the mooch says most. So if we can prove to you that the majority, so death and fizzling out, are better judged on the entirety of the relationship, we have to win this debate. I will take a POI if there is one.
Yeah, 80% of rape cases are by people who are already in the victim's lives. You tell us this is 1/3 of all women, therefore how does this weigh onto your side?
We think that rape is a horrifying crime, but what we also believe is that there are warning signs throughout these relationships when people are involved in relationships with their rapists. We think that there's signs that, they might be possessive over your body already. They might be, very objectifying over you. We think those are good warning signs to then pick up once you have then left this relationship and then carry into your future life, so then you don't get raped again, because you are more likely to go into a relationship, recognize the warning signs, and then get out. We also heard a little bit about divorce and stuff like that, and how these relationships end badly and everything, but we also tell you again that there are signs throughout these relationships, like they're based on shaky foundation, or for example there's been signs throughout that you guys just aren't meant for each other. This is the same with all relationships, as we will characterize to you throughout this debate. There are signs of abuse beforehand, like there are signs of attraction before a relationship. We view this as being symmetric on all sides of the house. Now onto my point on why it's not very why the end is not really reflective on the entirety of the relationship. We hear from the affirming side of the house that these endings are really emotive, and we do often agree that they are emotive, but as we have proved to you already, they are not often reflective on the relationship itself. It's more so reflective on the circumstance, and these help to do 2 things. First of all, it clouds the judgment of someone, so this can mean that someone might be really resentful towards this person for no good reason, or they might be resentful towards something this person represents. And we also believe again that this emotion should be directed against the person. So why are we letting it judge the whole of a relationship when it's just one moment? First of all, we tell you that the ending is the worst part of the relationship usually. Even in death and fizzling out, even in conflicting relationships, it's always hard. There are a lot of emotions involved, like you said, but it's losing love. It's losing that love that really makes it emotional. So no matter if it's the fault or not, it's saddening. For example, if my grandmother or my mum dies, I will be sad, angry, upset, but it wasn't how our relationship was. Our relationship was good and loving, and I want to judge my relationship based on that, not on what the affirming side of the house wants me to. Therefore, it doesn't take into account everything. Second of all, we tell you that, again, it is not the fault of either party often. We talk about, people moving away for work and people, getting cancer, dying of illness, It's no fault of either party, but because these are really negative experiences with heaps of emotions, we judge the relationship based off that, and it discards so much, all the happy moments, all the memories, all the trials and tribulations. Therefore, it's not reflective of the entire. And third of all, again, everyone has bad moments. This is with dealing with relationships that end on bad terms, So these endings are not always the whole story. First of all, people could be in, a passionate argument, heat of the moment, and they get carried away, personal weakness. That doesn't define the whole relationship. That just defines personal character weakness. And second of all, we see misunderstanding, like a lack of communication, bad signals, mixed comms. And so even in the worst relationship endings, heat of the moment situations and misunderstandings can happen. Therefore, it's not always reflective on the entire relationship. So the impact of all of this is that we've shown you that it's these endings are not always reflective on the whole relationship. We gave you multiple examples. Therefore, it ignores the rest of ignores all this relationship stuff, the ups and downs, the good and the bad. We want to take this into account on the negating side of the house. AF gives you an unreflective view of the relationship, streaked by sorrow and despair. We give you understanding, and that is my next point. The whole of the relationship, how it lasted, gives the individual greater understanding, giving them clarity on the relationship, lessons and good moments. So first of all, we say that these people are not as blinded by emotion when they look at the entirety of the relationship. The entirety is not as blindly emotive on the whole. First of all, that is because, again, the emotive part is usually the ending. Second of all, ups and downs often weigh each other out. And third of all, we have these everyday mundane parts of relationships. Therefore, we are looking at how it lasted. Looking at how it lasted is a lot less emotional, which means that we can look at everything else with a lot more clarity and a lot more judgment. We can look at the lessons, the trials, the good moments, so we can take things away from it better than we can if we just look at the ending. Now we look at the trials and the tribulations. Now these look like, fights, hard moments, like someone coming down with an illness or a friend losing their job. What do these do? These help teach the individual, firstly, skills, communication. Second of all, this helps to grow their empathy, which we think is good for everyday life. Third of all, we think it grows patience and loyalty as well, which we think are key characteristics of a good human being, all of which can be translated to later life, becoming a parent in their future relationships. This means that looking at all gives the individual much more understanding than on the affirming side of the house, where they just look at the ending. We hear from the affirming side of the house about cheating and abuse, but we think those are, again, limited cases. But if not, remember, reflecting on the whole allows you to learn. How it lasted helps you to see the signs, see the mistakes. These are where the key warning signs are. It gives hindsight, but only found in the whole relationship. Determine where to get out, how to do better. If we look at the ending, we just see the badness of it. But if we look at the relationship, we see how to get away from it in the future. Although it may be hard, the long-term benefits always outweigh. Third of all, we see that we lose the good moments. The good moments are never in the ending, Something happens to another person. For example, we look at something good happening to your significant other, or a marriage of someone, or the birth of your child, or we look at also, days out, funny moments, the good times in this. This gives the individual happiness, good memories we think are essential or negating to view the relationship, as it helps to reveal character and reveal the state of the relationship. This means that on affirming, they lose a key dimension of the relationship. Now, the impacts of this, it means that first of all, they gain more clarity on the relationship, so they can have a fairer judgment on the other person and an even clearer conscience. They feel better, they have a fairer judgment on the other party, and they are less likely to feel as much resentment. Second of all, we see that they keep the lessons learned. They help their future relationships. This is exclusive to us. Why? Because they don't see the trials, they don't see the positive moments. AF only wants us to see the front cover of the book. We want you to read the whole story. Thank you.
I'd like to let the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker for later.
when you spend 40 years in a happy marriage, when you love that person with all your heart, and then they die, that is the most important thing in your life, right? That grief is overwhelming. That is what always matters the most to you. Even if you had happy memories every day of your life, you wake up and you remember that your wife is not there lying beside you. Every day you're plagued with like that black hole, that missing space of your heart. Neg can never outweigh that. Couple things to do in this debate. Firstly, on framing what like each side looks like, then on if relationships tend to end badly and if they're reflective or not, then on if the good times matter, then on retrospectiveness. Okay, firstly then on framing. Note crucially this debate is about like believing that which side matters more, right? I don't think this is like how much it weighs on an individual on an individual level, right? It's not whether an individual should prioritize. It's not if we prefer them to focus on one aspect or another, if that improves their behavior or not. On both sides, both these things happens to individuals. It's how much it impacts them, like how much it weighs more on them. I think this cuts out a lot of their material when they tell you how the individual acts on it. Okay, first then on what the end looks like. We hear that it's either like death, divorces, or like just like bad things, right? I think we tell you that's very uncharitable for it to be like the exact moment where the divorce papers are signed, right? It's probably like the events leading up to it. It's probably when it turns bad, right? This is the week your boyfriend cheated on you and you try and resolve it and it ended up breaking up, right? This is the month-long breakup of the marriage when you finally agree to sign the divorce papers. This is the 2 weeks your friends started like icing you out before ghosting you. I think this is really helpful. Okay. Then on what it looks like on how it lasts, right? I think we both agree that it's probably just like the general cause. It's the general vibes. It's like of the, I think at the point where we can prove that if you buy how the relationship ends affects on how you think of all the rest of these memories, clearly the ending matters the most, right? There's a 50-50 chance your boyfriend, like your relationship with your boyfriend ends like nastily or like amicable, and that like either means you like loathe them or stay friends with them. I think it's pretty clear that outcome matters the most in the debate. Okay. Firstly then, on whether relationships tend to end badly and if that's reflective. I think the ending like inherently sucks, right? We tell you at Emily that it has to reach a crisis point one way or another. They give you the example of like just slowly drifting away. I think at the point when you do just like have to sign the divorce papers at some point, we have to like go into court and like figure out who gets the custody of the kids, who gets the house, how the assets are split. I think that probably sucks even if you were just like the entirety of your relationship was somehow just like drifting away. But I think also here, we tell you about just like the tangible outcomes of the ending sucking, right? Divorce, you lose custody of your kids, right? You have a big blowout with your boyfriend and now your entire friend group is split, right? I think that's really, really harmful. Then on the point of whether it's reflective, I think we hear a big push here about how it's like circumstance and you shouldn't just like focus on this one thing. I firstly don't think this like engages in the debate. Like I don't think it matters if someone like yelling at you and having a big blowout is reflective of the whole argument if you carry that with you for like the rest for like years and years, right? I think firstly we hear that you shouldn't focus on the grief, that it's happy times, right? I think I flagged to you in my intro that grief is always going to be the biggest impact, is always going to stay with you for the rest of your life, right? If your wife dies, you never remarry, right? You stay alone for 20 years, you always like carry that grief with you. That's hugely helpful. I think secondly here they tell you about it's being carried away and the lack of communication, and like if you dwell on that, it's really harmful for you. And it is still an impact, right? If you get in a screaming match, you like cry for days afterwards, you felt like huge emotions, that's hugely harmful, right? The mood isn't how do we judge a relationship, it's what matters. If the ending is like a redefining moment of how you view that person, of how you view yourself, if it's like permanent trauma, I think that's a huge harm. Lastly here, on abusive relationships, note this is my standard contribution, right? I think when they tell you that you'll be able to identify red flags, I just don't think this works, right? Because I think when you focus on how it goes, you focus on like the majority of the time, which is good, right? That's why you stay in this abusive relationships. That's why you fell in love with the first place, right? These memories of the good times get you through the bad times. It's how you justify it to your friends and parents. I think these memories are what keep you trapped. I don't think they shouldn't matter at all, right? The honeymoon to Bali is not important. What is important is the end of the relationship, right? When they tried to kill you with their bare hands because they were angry you were leaving, right? I think the ending is what's important. When you're finally brave enough to leave the relationship, to grab all your stuff in the car and leave and get out of that like 2-year toxic situation. I think at the point when the relationship ends really badly, right? When he gets super mad, flies into a rage and sends you to the hospital and you have a scar for your rest of life, I think that is clearly what matters most to the individual. I think if you literally get killed, that is like the biggest impact on the debate. That is what what matters most. Lastly then, on do the good times matter? How much do they weigh up on a person? I think, again, it's not better to focus on or prioritize, it's just the impact of the individual. I don't think the good times have a massive emotional impact. Why is this? Firstly, because nice experiences tend to be all very similar. They tend to be generic, right? You have 5 boyfriends, it's probably all the same. You go out, like, get coffee, eat ice cream on the beach. Like, it's kind of all, like, very similar. I think in comparison, like, harmful experiences are uniquely awful. Every argument you get in still, like, sucks. They're all different, they're all equally harmful. But I think secondly here, there's a limit to how much happiness you can get from these nice moments. They tell you themselves that they're mostly all mediocre, just like slightly bit good. I think there's a limit here. I think the sad, awful, unhappy moments stay with you far more. Panel, you probably still remember the awful breakup you had in high school, your friend that betrayed you. I think that stays with you much longer. You probably just forget all those good times you had. They stay with you much longer, right? Because they're rare, because it's far more emotionally draining, because it's just like unpleasant to deal with that stuff. I think those stay with you much longer. I think that is how we prove that they matter way less, right? Because they're not as deep, because the impacts of like an harmful ending stays with you for a much long time. I think also here, I don't think you just don't want to, they tell you about reading the whole story. I just don't think you do want to read the whole story if your friend just like suddenly goes through. I don't think you want to go through all that past trauma. What stays with you is that. But lastly here, on retrospective note, if we even prove to a slight degree, okay, I'll take the POI.
You said at the start that the loss is mighty when you lose a loved one, but how does that loss, the missing of that person occur?
Because they like die in a car crash or they die like peacefully in their sleep. I don't think it matters how you do it. Every day you wake up and they're not yet there, and that sucks. Okay, on to retrospective. I think if we prove that you like literally changes how you view this person, how you view these memories, we just win, right? Because if the ending changes it, we just win, right? I think the specific nature of memories, right? Every time you recall a memory, you craft it again in your mind. You imagine it. It twists and changes every time. At the point when the ending is bad, you like slowly twist all the positives into negatives. At the point where like, I don't know, we tell you, Emily, like if the parent that you've had a bad relationship forgives you, you like suddenly are able to like find love, to find affection in these memories. I think that's hugely powerful. I think what they tell you about signs. I think you don't go back and look for signs unless the ending is bad, right? You never look back at the signs your boyfriend is cheating on you until you find out you've cheated and you break up, right? But I think secondly here, they tell you about better able to evaluate. I think at the point when the ending permanently changes the way you go forward in life now, that is the biggest impact, right? You have trauma, like you have trust issues because your boyfriend cheated. Now you're like overly suspicious and you pry into everyone else's life. Maybe you just really struggle to hide. But I think secondly here, why would you ever end a relationship based on signs of abuse? I tell you all this framing about abusive relationships. You don't end it until it gets really bad. That is when you get out. Waiting on ending, right? I think no matter how good a relationship is, no matter how many good memories, the idea that these good moments are lost to the void, unrecoverable when a loved one dies, that is so huge, right? Considering everyone dies, that is a lot of relationships ending in really sad ways, right? Maybe it's gruesome and bloody and you have to like see your loved one after they've been in a car crash. That is a huge harm. You never forget that pain. It sticks with you forever. We just win that debate on that impact alone. I'm so proud to stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite the second speaker of the negating.
A while ago, I had a grandma who was one of the greatest people in the world. She was kind, caring, and funny. However, to my infinite sorrow, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and a year later, she was dead. I choose to remember her by who she was, by all the great memories we made together, not by the end of our relationship, when I looked into her eyes and no flash of recognition passed through them. AF has to stand for remembering these relationships by these devastating ends, while here in affirming we stand for the whole picture, not a brief snapshot. So a few questions in the speech. Firstly, what does each side generally look like? Secondly, my systemic contribution on the tangible harms from AF side. And thirdly, on why does the end actually matter? Now firstly, onto what does each side generally look like. I think on AF side of the house, people do remember the end because they see this this is what matters the most. They see this as the most important on AF side of the house. So I think you believe the end matters, if you believe the end matters the most, like you do on AF side, you will only remember the end. And no, this is actually very harmful. I think I'll expand more of this on my substantive. However, I think on our side of the house, you do have this belief that the whole relationship is generally more important. And I think thus, you're more likely to remember the whole relationship as you believe that this is what is most important, not just the ending few years. I think this allows you to dodge many of the harm on AF's side, and you can reap the benefits by Spertika outlined. I think this mitigates a lot of AF's point on the depth of impact. But I think if you just do believe that the end isn't what matters the most, I think that a lot of the impacts that they give you are largely mitigated. Now, onto my substantive contribution about why does focusing on the end harm you in the future? Well, firstly, you're less likely to enter relationships in the future. Why? Well, the majority of relationships, as they're characterized, don't exactly end in a super happy ending. Even if it is just fizzling out relationship, this isn't really happy. So I think you start to associate a negative connotation with relationships if they do all end negatively and you only focus on this negative end. I think this means you're less likely to enter them in the future. Secondly, you have a more general negative worldview. You become more pessimistic. You start to believe that things won't end well, and as relationships are a huge part of your life, if they become negative, a large portion of your life becomes tinted black. You start to see the world with these black shades on. Now thirdly, I think you just lose a lot of lessons learned during the relationships, and sort of continuing on from my first speaker's point, I think in a more positive relationship, this looks like losing clarity on how to be kind and caring, or losing clarity as to why you should be kind and caring if it all ends in a negative manner, say death. I think in more negative relationships is the large push we get from AF. I think on their side of the house, you ignore how they the things that are built up to this negative ending. I think you ignore all the warning signs and you sort of lose the ability to recognize these warning signs because you only focus on the end of the relationship. You don't focus on all the warning signs that came previously. So what are the impacts of this? Well, firstly, I think at the lowest level, you have to believe that you are more unhappy on our side of the house, which is a harm you should not underestimate as what is life but a path towards joy. And secondly, I think you're just less likely to enter healthy and positive relationships in the future as you will be scared of entering relationships and you'll lose these valuable lessons from your previous relationships because once again you don't view the journey as important, you only view the instant joy as important, so you don't remember the journey, you don't remember all these important lessons that you learnt. And now thirdly, I think that people who do enter new relationships will be likely to enter relationships that are toxic. Now why is this? Well, once again, they lose the journey. They lose the ability to recognize all these warning signs that were present along the journey before your boyfriend, say, raped you. And I think that this means that you are more likely to be a victim once again in the future on our side of the house. Because if you only focus on the end, you lose the ability to recognize all these warning signs. You lose all these lessons. Now, onto why does the end actually matter? I think this engages the most with our side of the case. I think this actually wins us the debate all by itself. So, I think that how the relationship lasting, mattering the most, is actually logically prior to the ending. The end only matters due to how the relationship lasted. I think if you only engage fully with AF case and you essentially ignore all of our substantive material, this is how we win completely under AF's framing. Now, why is this? Well, I think that death, for example, the death of a loved one, the death of family, the death of friends. Why is this important? I don't think we care about the death of a random person out in the world. We only care about the death of someone because of all the because of all the memories we had together. We care about the death of a loved one due to the journey, due to the path we had together, due to all the good memories. You don't just suddenly care about the death of a random person. So I think this means that the journey does matter more because if the journey didn't matter more, then you wouldn't wouldn't care about the end. It's logically prior. Now let's look at, for example, divorce, which is another big push from F. You only care about really a divorce because once again, you had positive memories on the journey. You likely started a relationship in love, you had children together, and all of this was because the journey matters. It is the most important. The negative impacts of, like, say, a divorce are only relevant because of the journey. If you don't believe that the journey is important, then frankly, you get none of the harms you get like none of the harms which F say you will get. I'll take a pill right now.
There's a limit to how much dopamine you can get from a positive experience. Is there a limit to how much grief you can feel from when a loved one dies?
I'm not sure how much of a limit there is. I think it's a very arbitrary limit. And then once again, I think as I said previously, why do you feel grief when a loved one dies? Once again, if let's say this is an unlimited grief, where does all this grief come from? It comes from the journey. It comes from all the previous experiences you had together. This is what I'm trying to get through to you. I think that the death only matters, the end only matters at all because of the journey mattering. If you engage with Af's framing of the mattering more in the motion, meaning that, well, what actually has like the greatest impact just in that moment. I think we do win this because once again, it only matters, like Af's whole entire case only matters because the journey matters. However, I think you are also likely to engage at least to some degree under our framing, where it matters more means what has a greater net positive, like judging by the end versus judging by the whole. I think I've given you a lot of substantive on this in regards to, well, there's lots of harms by judging the relationship only by the end. It means you lose a lot of the lessons along the way. It means that you're likely to have a pessimistic worldview. It means you're unlikely to form more healthy relationships in the future. And I think that if you judge the relationship by its whole, however, you do actually get this lesson. You do actually get these lessons. You do actually remember all these positive experiences. Because if you believe that the path matters more, you will remember all the love time you spent with your grandma. You will remember all the good memories you made together. You won't just remember her on her deathbed. So, at the end of this, I think what you have to believe is that if you engage under our framing, where essentially the actual impacts matter more, then we clearly win this debate because once again, we have a lot more actual impacts. However, I think if you engage purely under Af's framing, where it's like why matters more, they say what will stick with you the longest. I think, once again, the whole entire case is essentially purely contingent on our case. The end, in most cases, only matters due to the journey. I think on our side of the house, all the impacts they get is only because of the journey. So I think by matters more, you have to believe that on our side of the house, the journey does matter more, the journey is the most important, and that is why we win this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to then speak for this speech and invite up the third speaker to the affirmative team.
Neg tells us right from the start of their line that you do not judge an entire movie based on one scene, and that one scene cannot change the entirety of a series of events. I don't know if Neg's ever watched Fight Club, but I think there are plenty of movies where one scene changes the way that you think about everything. We think relationships are exactly like this too. Okay, a couple of things to do in this speech, right? Firstly, on clarifying some framing, right? Then secondly, on the trauma, and then lastly, on perception of relationships, right? Which will make sense when I do the framing, right? So a couple of things here, right? Firstly, like this idea that we hear constantly about like belief, right? The negative side seems to think that this is a debate about what people in these positions should focus on, like imperatively, what they should believe, right? What we tell you all the way down the line is that what matter means in this debate, I think it's an important thing for everybody to agree on, right, is like probably two different things, right? I think to some degree, maybe it's the way that these people perceive these relationships. I think largely it's just an objective weighing of what actually has the most impact on them, right? I feel like there's a couple of reasons like for this, right? Like I think people just have like quite a low capacity to decide how they view things that happen to them emotionally in their lives, right? People are not robots. They're very incapable of doing objective performance reviews of the things that they've done, especially when things like love are involved, right? So I think that, and then additionally here, right, is how do we allocate weight to these things? We hear this kind of twisting here that if you are sad because a family member dies, that actually is like a point for neg, right? Because you're only sad because of how things lasted and the ending is irrelevant here, right? I don't like how messy this is, so I'm going to try and clear it up to you, right? I think firstly, the irrelevance that you have to buy on belief here clears this up, right? But secondly, I think what the comparative here for is neg is not that you like think about the end of the relationship for a different reason, right? Because I think that's quite squirrely. I think instead what they have to stand for is that you are affected like less by the death than you were by the love of that person when you were still alive, right? They cannot claim both of them. That's just a little bit silly and I don't like it very much, right? Okay, so then let's talk about trauma here, right? So I feel like when matters is like largely so broad, I think this is the material that you have to weigh the most, right? This is the material that stands no matter what people like choose to believe about the relationships, no matter what capacity they have to be an emotionless robot, right? If something traumatic happens to you, that's really important because there are like objective subconscious effects that you cannot control, right? This is exclusive of what people believe, right? So firstly on death here, right? So we tell you that death here of anybody that you love is super, super traumatic, right? It causes you to be depressed. Maybe you don't remarry. Maybe you have like long-lasting trauma, right? It changes everything for you. Essentially then what we hear is again this push that Neg tries to flip this because actually you only care about them because you love them. And also that like the happy memories like weigh them out, which I think is the actual comparative, right? I think firstly here, note like Neg seems to talk about these points a lot as if your parents can like only die when they're old. Note that I think this is imperatively not true. I think if you are like 11 years old and your parents like tragically die in a car crash, that death is going to be so important to you. It changes the course of the rest of your life. Maybe you grow up in an orphanage. That's really, really bad. That's obviously quite an extreme example, but I don't think every case of your parents dying looks like them like being 195 with cancer in their deathbed in the hospital, right? I think a lot of this is defined on your view on the framing. That's why I spend so much time on it, right? But at the end of this, I think even if you buy that death is most endings, I think it still always outweighs the love that you feel. I think you always are thinking about your wife dying in that car crash rather than that time that you went to the museum together and looked at the dinosaur bones, right? So then on rough endings, right? We tell you here about like abuse, cheating, etc. That leads to trust issues. That is like probably the biggest harm in this debate, right? Essentially the counter that we hear is that when you focus on the end, you're not being a good performance reviewer and you miss signs and this happens to you like again, right? I think what we tell you here, firstly, the end of these relationships is always when they are most abusive and always when they are the worst. It is the breaking point, right? Okay, secondly, I do not buy Neg's focus push here, right? I don't think anybody has the willpower to just will themselves into not being traumatized by an event just by like focusing on the objectively right bits. It's not a book, it's not a film, it's real life, right? And then here, I think the real outcome, right, that prevents you from future relationships is the subconscious trauma that stops you from going into these relationships at all, or it's the trauma that like makes you really controlling that Emily tells you about, that you push people away subconsciously. You're not doing that as an objective measure of how do I like best work in a relationship. It's just that your brain is altered and that harms the rest of your life. That's why this really, really matters to you, right? So how do you then panel, like where do you give this clash to? I think you have to give it on the metric of agency, right? I think how much do you believe that people's beliefs and their interior like rationale controls how much trauma they feel by events or controls where their emotions lie. I think if you buy what I'm telling you, that most people don't have that level of like Buddhist monk meditation and that they can't do that, I think you have to give this clash to us, right? Because this is what affects people regardless of their perception on their relationships. I'll take that POI before I continue.
So you said that grief is the most important part of the ending of the relationship. But what happens when it's not the fault of either party and someone applies that emotion to the relationship?
Like, I just don't think it needs to be the fault of either party. I don't think you're sad because it's like, my mom died of cancer. Like, how could she? I'm so annoyed, right? You die because you can't see her anymore, right? Like, the ending is really, really bad no matter. I just don't think blame plays into it at all, quite frankly. Like, obviously you're going to, in some cases where somebody's hurt you, like intentionally, but that just doesn't necessarily matter all the time. Then on perception of relationships, right? I think this is like a pretty big push from Neg here, the idea that like you need to be really accurate on these relationships, right? Like one moment doesn't define the whole thing, that understanding of a relationship is a benefit in and of itself. I think what they really need to do is, again, prove people's ability to like self-performance review quite objectively, and that leads to better relationships in the future, or just that understanding of relationships is inherently a benefit in and of itself, right? For us, I think we have a big path to victory here that isn't engaged with enough on reframing, right? We tell you another way that the end of a relationship matters so much is because it actually changes the entire way in which you perceive the relationship that happened before, right? That is a big way in which it matters. Emily explains to you why this works, right? We don't hear enough response, right? So then on understanding of relationship, right? We tell you that the end can like reframe this. I think we can reframe the understanding of relationship as like with the benefit of forgiveness. Maybe your mother forgives you on your deathbed, whatever, right? And what we hear again is this idea that like one moment doesn't define the relationship, like it's stupid to look at things like that. All right, as I flagged to you in my intro, right, all of the examples they give about like movies and books just like also work for us. Like a lot of books have like one really, really important page that changes the whole thing, right? But this isn't a film review. You cannot be objective here, right? And we tell you on our side that you are hyper-focused on warning signs. You're actually more likely to almost be objective than you are on them because they are reframed. Whereas in the relationship, you're like, oh, my boyfriend's just going on a business meeting. Well, I hope he brings me some donuts, right? Now on our side, you're thinking, okay, yeah, he was cheating. How do I avoid that in the future? I think you're unlikely on either side to be objective, but you're more likely on our side because you've toughened up. The hindsight is the best sight that you could possibly get here, right? Neg says that this leads to lessons, right? Neg is trying to prove to you throughout the entire debate that people wise up and they focus on the right things and that makes them smarter, right? I think the subconscious lessons are always more impactful here, right? I think subconsciously you can't trust people, you're really depressed, that's really bad, and that's what I'm proud to do.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the third speaker of the meeting.
Oh, shit. Oh, I'll just use my phone. Sorry. Hashtag winning.
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. God, I would hate to live on the affirmative side of the house. The affirmative side wants to tell you that all life is terrible, horrible things where you don't remember any of the good things and then you die. And personally, I think that just sucks because that is just inherently not true about life. We go through these horrible things for one reason, because of the good times, because majority of the times aren't bad. And that's what's most important in our lives, right? Is focusing on those good things and learning how to avoid those bad things. In this debate, the affirming team's whole push, right, is that your entire relationship is defined by key moments that are horrible and bad, and that those are the biggest impacts in this case. And in this speech, I will prove to you why, even if that is true, how we on the negating side can show you why you actually only get those impacts that the affirmative team is pushing when you look at your whole relationships. On our first point of clash, which side gives you more reflection on your relationship? To gain anything from a relationship, right, you have to reflect on it. You have to think back about it and be like, okay, why did this happen? What can we change in the future? To get any impacts from either side of the house, you need to be reflecting carefully on your relationship, right? And knowing why it's good, right? So firstly, what have they said about that? They said, like, you don't, like, with what you say around this is that huge impacts endings have larger impacts, and that you don't think about anything but that ending, and it's the only thing you reflect on. And that, like, if, for example, if you're getting raped, you don't care about the good times. But the thing is, the reason you stay in these bad relationships, the reason you put up with abuse is because of the good times. And when it finally boils up to the end and you leave, you have to think about that. You have to be like, why did I stay? If you just look at the bad things, you're more likely to end up in a relationship like that again, because you're not realizing why you stay, and you're not unpicking the whole reasons why you do. And, like, good things are inherently more important to your relationship because they are what is inherently getting you through those bad times, right? That is why you stay with your abuser, because of the good times. And when you don't understand that, and when you don't reflect on it, you are just going to fall into those things. They've also said that good things don't matter because of bad things, and that, well, if you're a kid and your parent dies, then it doesn't matter about any of the good things because that just sucks. Well, the thing is, AF believes that this, like, trauma lasts forever and that you're never going to get over it, and that is just inherently untrue. We go to therapy because it's simply not enjoyable to be living with these bad things all the time. So when we get over this trauma, and we're not saying that you don't feel sad ever, what gets you through is the good parts of the relationship, the most of it, when you had times together. That is the most important impact in this debate, because that is what matters to you, is not that your parent died, but that even if it's only 3 years you got with them, you got those times where you remember it, because we all have tragedies in our life, and if we aren't able to take the good out with the bad, and if we only look at the bad and get angry and upset about that happening, then you don't get what matters in this debate, which is the positive impacts. And thirdly, on to our second point of clash, mastery. What matters? AF tells you that what sticks with you afterwards is trauma, but this has a few problems because it's not always your fault of either party, and you apply that emotion to that. Eva said that this hasn't been rebutted, and that trauma can't reflect the quality of a relationship. What we tell you is what is reflective on a relationship, because when you reflect on your relationship, you allow the individual to live better and speak about their relationship, and it's not just from the emotions you feel in that moment, because especially if the ending is bad, you're going to be very clouded with emotion, so you're just not even going to be able to remember it clearly, and so you're going to have to look back on it anyways, because those are the things where you're going to be able to pick out what matters most in the relationship. And even if it is reflective on the whole, the ending, even if you can prove that the ending is just a good reflection of it and it is most important, you're going to just be inherently more biased in your ending, because if it's a negative ending, you think that you inherently are on the right side because you know why you did all of your actions and you have your internal reasons why you did them. And so you're always going to be biased towards yourself, and you're going to be able to rationalize that. And so the best way to get rid of this bias and to be able to look at this relationship clearly is to be able to look at it as a whole and understand every single aspect of the relationship, and you only get that on the negating side of the house. And the impact of this is, even if you buy that an ending is good, we have proved to you that there is more bias on an individual case, and that if you care about reflecting, and if you care about learning and understanding and growing as a person, and if you think that mattering is about how this will reflect to you on the future, then you have to reflect on the whole, because that is what's going to impact you and change the way you live your life. I will take a POI.
If your boyfriend hits you twice, that 80% of your relationship is the good times. That is the duration. Why then do you learn anything?
Because if you believe that relationship lasts, as we have both agreed that fail, then you're going to think, why did I stay? Why did I let those good times outweigh those harms? Because when you think about it, it's like, if there's good in a relationship and there's also bad, you stay because of the good, and then you eventually leave because the bad outweighs it. You have to understand that, hey, even when there was good times, there was bad, and I shouldn't have put up with it. And so that's going to change you. It's going to impact you in the future. And that is what's the mattering of the relationship, is understanding the good with the bad, and understanding why you stayed in those negative situations. Because both sides of the house give you bad relationships and agree that there are bad and traumatic relationships. But do you know what the negating side has proved that has not really been touched on by the affirmative side? Is that we give you a clear reason on why we personally will be able to get you better impacts afterwards. And that's what matters, right? Is both sides know that relationships end and that there are bad ones, but we can prove to you that you can get more out of it. And that's what matters, right? Is that you can get more out of it, and that you can change, and that you can learn, and that you can grow. Because the entirety of the affirming case basically rests on that trauma is bad and it really affects you. And yeah, that's true. But as we have pointed out, that trauma happens because of all the stuff that happened before the trauma. You can't just say, oh, the trauma is the only part that matters, because you only get that because of the care. And as we have already told you, you get over that trauma, and then what you're left with is the stuff that happened afterwards, and learning how to take that forward and matter. If you care about what matters most, and if you care about impacting people in a way that will positively impact their lives and is going to affect them more long-lastingly, then you have to side with side negating, as we have proven to you how we will change people's lives, how people's lives will be more impacted and more changed, because they will be doing things because of what they have learned, and that will matter more to them, as their lives will be inherently more different because they look at the relationship as a whole and can use that as a way to guide their decisions in the future. I am incredibly proud to negate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and as is customary, reverse the speaking order and line up the reply speaker for the occasion.
In a world where we say we value the whole story, we tell you that relationships are no exception. Well, F thinks only the last page of the book matters. We tell you what matters are the trials and tribulations, how you loved and supported each other, and the lessons you learned along the way. The journey is the most important thing in this debate, not the destination. I think that there are two main different framings of this motion. A, that there's like an objective weighing of the impact on the individual. And B, that the impacts in regards to what you receive from judging the relationship like by the end versus by the journey. So, I think on the second framing, if you believe this, we win this debate outright. I think this is sufficiently proven that judging by the whole is better than judging by the last page. As such, I'll focus on our worst case, where you don't buy any of our framing, when you don't buy that learning from a relationship is important, where you don't buy that the love you felt for someone is important, where you just care about like the end and the impact that has on you. So, we hear a few pushes from F on this, but I think it sums up to relationship ending is bad, your relationship is defined by the end. Well, we believe on our side that this frankly isn't true. I implore you to think of all the relationships that have ended in your life. We've all had some. We've all had relationships that have fizzled out, that have ended perhaps in death, that have even ended maybe in a toxic manner. Do you only remember the end? Or do you remember all of the good times? Do you remember all the fun experiences you had together, all the great memories you made? Do you remember that, or do you only remember the end? I think that if Af's case were true, you would never enter into a relationship again. Why? Well, Af themselves have said that the ends are always negative. So if relationships are purely determined by the end, why would you ever enter into a new relationship? If, let's say, a romantic relationship is only determined by the end, and if it does end in, say, toxicity, if it does end in abuse, why would you ever enter a new relationship if you don't remember all the good, fun times you might have had together? If you don't look at any of the positives, you frankly never enter into a new relationship if you can. If a friendship ends in grief, if you were falling out in a friendship, well, if you believe Af's case, then once again, you'd never enter a friendship again. Why? Because if you judge it only by the ending, and the ending is negative, then why would you ever enter into a negative thing? Why would you ever enter into a relationship? I think that in regards to family, both teams have agreed that it often ends with death. Yet, death only matters due to how the relationship lasted. The grief from death will not somehow surpass the love you felt for someone. Why? Well, because the grief is quite literally contingent on the amount of love you feel. The grief for a very loved family member is going to be much larger than the grief for, say, a random person. Why is this? Well, it's because of the journey. It's because of all the previous experiences you've had together. And this is what matters most. All these negative experiences that you feel at the end, they only are there because of the journey. And why does this matter? Well, frankly, if they're only there because of the journey, then the journey matters the most. If there were no journey, then there would be no end. However, on our side of the house, we believe that this journey does matter, and because of the journey mattering, the end might matter as well, but once again, the journey matters the most. Now let's look at friendships, for example. Well, friendships often fizzle out. Often you might move away, you might have a falling out. However, this end often isn't really dramatic. So I think this is quite a large scale in the debate, because once again, a lot of relationships are friendships, and the ending often isn't super dramatic, it's not super trauma. It's not like it doesn't have a huge trauma on you. However, I think there's lots of good memories you make along the way. There's lots of positive experiences, and these are what you remember, not the ending. Otherwise, once again, why would you have a friendship again? Now, the main push we hear from AF is in regards to relationships. However, once again, relationships, toxic relationships, are actually only a very small minority. And in the motion, it quite literally stated that we believe that most of the time, that it's most important to judge it. It matters most if you judge it by the journey than by the destination. And that is why we win this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to conclude today's speech and welcome up the reply speaker from the
Nick tells us a lot about journey versus destination. But when the destination is harms as severe as getting murdered by your husband, there is no journey anymore. The car has crashed and you're dead. A couple of things to do in this reply. Firstly, on some general framing at the top of this debate, then on the abyss case, and then on these irrevocable harms that we tell you about from first. Okay. Firstly, a couple things to note at the top of this debate. We tell you since birth that people aren't robots. You can't choose how you feel. What this does for the debate is it means that even if you believe everything they tell you, that people should dwell on the happy times, we tell you since first that they distort in their subconscious. They can't escape the black hole of grief. Insofar as you believe that people just get over grief really quickly and move on with their lives, they get over things like rape really quickly and get on with their lives, that's when you agree with Nick, right? I don't think that is the world we live in. I think these are things that ruin your life permanently. We tell you this changed the trajectory of your life. This debate is about that more often than not, how a relationship ends is more important than how, the duration of it was. Considering we tell you that often the duration is distorted, we tell you about things like how maybe 90% of an abusive relationship was really good, and that 10% was the 2 times he hit you. That's the duration that you are perceiving. That's really harmful for their case. But then onto the abuse case, operating under their framing, right? So even if it should matter more, they tell us that, like, you only remember the end and not the journey, and you lose your ability to see the signs. Look, where do you actually see the signs? When you look retrospectively, because of the mechanism we give you at first on hindsight. You see the signs in light of the ending. If your boyfriend cheated on you, next time you do look out for the signs, because the end is trauma and pain. Even if it is logically prior, I think two things here. The first thing is the fact that time exists shouldn't be the reason you give this debate. The second thing is that the harm of the ending functions without, like, the consideration of the duration. We tell you about thousands of women's close relationships ending in things like assault. Maybe there were no signs, but maybe it doesn't matter, because that singular moment is what crumbles your foundation, is what permanently, like, ruins that thing. If it is contingent, I think death still just ruins the journey. I think even the absolute best case, right? If you get more out of being horrifically abused, I just don't think that's a harm, right? I think having to work through these, like, awful things, if that's the only benefit they stand for, you must first undergo that terrible thing. I refuse to stand for it. I think then on to, like, these irreparable harms that we tell you about how just, like, ridiculously corrupting they are. Look, this is about more often than not. Therefore, what is most cases look like? We tell you this mostly looks like things like, death, everyone in the world, divorce, half of all relationships, things like fights, things like abuse, things like cheating. Insofar as we prove that death's ending always matters most, because you never escape the, like, black hole of it, we do a lot of this at Shay. I think you also note here that AF can only win under the idea of death. They can only win insofar as maybe you have an amazing positive reflection on your relationship with your grandmother, and her peaceful death lets you see the good and positive impacts. This doesn't engage with the hundreds of children who go into foster care because their relationship with their mother ends when she chooses heroin over them and overdoses. This doesn't engage with young trans people being kicked out onto the street by their parents because the ending of the relationship was that argument about their identity. This doesn't engage with thousands of women who literally get raped by people they think they're closest friends, by their boyfriend, by their parents sometimes, right? I think inherently this is the moment of the ending. We tell you about things like divorce, we tell you about splitting the assets. We win alone purely on what we've told you already, that the impact of these events themselves, of these endings themselves, permanently ruin your life. The happiness and the positive benefit of that will never outweigh the harms to millions and millions of people. I am proud to stand.
Right. Thank you both teams for an excellent debate. Across the forum, take care.